Security! Get him out. He's not my dad. My son pointed at me. Christmas music played midway through. The tree lights flickered, and every guest turned to look at me, the wineglass still in hand. My wife stood silently next to my son. My chest was burning, but I didn't cry. I left quietly, but I returned the next day, with a lawyer. Before we dive into how it came to this, if you believe karma always finds its way, hit subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Christmas music played midway through. The tree lights flickered, and every guest turned to look at me, the wineglass still in hand. My wife stood silently next to my son. My chest was burning, but I didn't cry. I left quietly, but I returned the next day, with a lawyer. Before we get into the story, if you believe that karma always finds a way, please subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. Christmas lights winked. The lobby smelled of pine. I stood by the fountain with a glass of red wine, rehearsing how I would congratulate my son in front of his new partners. I pictured him saying, "That's my dad, the man who believed in me." Instead, he grabbed the microphone. "Security! Get him out. He's not my dad." The music stalled. The tree lights flickered, and faces turned toward me. My wife, still my wife on paper, did not blink. She stood beside him as if the years I carried this family were a rumor. A guard stepped forward. I set my glass on a tray, nodded, and walked out through a corridor of eyes. I did not cry. Outside, December air burned my lungs. My breath rose and vanished like my promises to be patient, the bigger man. I walked the block until the sting cooled into something harder, useful. By morning, I would return with a lawyer and a memory sharp as a blade. You need to know what came before that night. When Brandon was little, he slept on my chest while I counted his breaths. I skipped a promotion to coach his Saturday soccer. I sold my small yacht when he said he wanted to start a company. The money paid his first year of rent and the computers he bragged about. Then he married into a family that measured worth in chandeliers and last names. Dinners turned formal. Invitations evaporated. He laughed at my old suits and my paper planner. My wife began echoing him soft at first, then sharp. "Let the boy handle things. You're retired." Read an Arkin. At the gala, I walked in believing there was still a bridge between us. I wore the navy blazer he once said made me look like a real boss. I brought a simple gift, an antique fountain pen from my banking days. When he pointed and called me a stranger, something in me snapped like a branch under ice. Humiliation is heat, betrayal is frost. Together, they harden a man. That night I went home alone, laid the pen on my desk, and opened the old locked drawer. Contracts, transfers, letters. I steadied my hands and began to remember everything. Sleep did not come easy that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard it again, his voice sharp, disgusted, commanding strangers to erase me from his world. "He's not my dad." Those words sliced deeper than any knife. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, tracing cracks in the plaster like the years of sacrifice I had poured into him. When Brandon was a boy, I believed no dream was too costly if it was his. I worked extra hours at the bank, taking night shifts as a consultant so he could attend the best private schools. I told myself I was building him wings, even if it meant clipping my own. I passed up a promotion that would have sent me overseas because I wanted to be there for his science fairs, his birthdays, the quiet nights he needed help with math homework. I thought fatherhood meant putting his needs ahead of every ambition of my own. I remember the night I sold the yacht. She was not a grand vessel, just a modest boat I had saved for over a decade to buy. I imagined retiring on her, drifting along the coast with my wife, watching sunsets. But Brandon came home, eyes bright, saying, "Dad, I have this idea for a startup." He needed capital, and the bank would not lend to someone with no record. So I gave up my dream, signed the papers, handed him the money. His smile that night felt worth more than the ocean. And when he graduated, I was the loudest in the stands. I clapped until my palms stung, certain that our bond was forged forever. That day he hugged me, whispered, "Couldn't have done it without you, Dad." I carried those words like scripture. Yet, little by little, distance crept in. Calls grew shorter, visits became rare. Then he married her, the woman with a diamond smile, and a family dripping with money. I saw the shift immediately. Suddenly, I was background noise, a relic he had outgrown. Still, I clung to hope. I told myself seasons change, suns come back, but the coldness only deepened, and that Christmas night proved he had buried me long before he said the words. After the wedding, everything about Brandon began to change. He was still my son in blood, but in spirit, he belonged to another family, her family, the ones with crystal chandeliers and long dinner tables where every laugh sounded rehearsed. They welcomed him, but not me. I was tolerated, at best a guest at my own son's life. At first it was small things. He stopped calling me Dad in public. He would say Pablo instead, as if the word father embarrassed him. At business dinners, he introduced his in-laws with pride, then nodded toward me, like I was an afterthought. When I tried to share stories from my banking days, he cut me short, telling me, "That's not how things work anymore." I noticed how my wife's smile shifted. She laughed at his jokes when they were at my expense. She defended him when I asked why he no longer visited. "He's busy, Pablo. Don't take it so personally." But I did. How could I not? Every slight chipped away at the life I had built. There was one dinner I will never forget. His wife's parents were hosting, their house a palace compared to mine. I sat at the far end of the table, listening as Brandon spoke about his company, his achievements, his future. Not once did he mention the money I had poured into his dreams, the nights I stayed awake balancing budgets so he could risk everything on an idea. When I raised a toast to him, he gave me a thin smile and turned to his father-in-law. This man taught me everything. That night, I drove home in silence. My wife told me not to be dramatic, but I could still feel the sting. I had never asked for glory. All I wanted was acknowledgement that I mattered, that the years I gave up were not wasted. The distance grew colder with each passing month. The phone hardly rang. Holidays were excuses to avoid me. Slowly, I realized the family I thought I had was slipping through my fingers. And by the time Christmas arrived, I was already the ghost he wanted me to be. The engagement party was supposed to be a celebration, a moment where family came together. I told myself this would be my chance to feel close to Brandon again. I paid for the entire event venue, catering, music, everything. I thought generosity might remind him of the bond we once shared. But when the night came, I felt like a stranger in the crowd I had funded. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers. Guests in tailored suits clinked champagne glasses, laughing over violin music. I watched from the corner, proud yet anxious. I expected Brandon to introduce me as the man who made all of this possible. Instead, he walked arm in arm with his fiancée and her parents, beaming as though they alone had carried him to this place. When the master of ceremonies asked for a few words from the family, Brandon handed the microphone to his future father-in-law. I waited, thinking surely he would pass it to me afterward. But the speech ended, and applause filled the room. Brandon nodded to the band, and the music started again. My name was never spoken. I tried to shake it off. I moved through the crowd, greeting guests, telling myself it didn't matter. But then I overheard him introduce me to someone from her side. "This is Pablo. He helps out now and then." Helps out, as if I were a hired hand, not the father who sacrificed everything. The words sank deeper than I wanted to admit. At the end of the night, I stood alone near the exit while people congratulated the happy couple. My wife walked past me, her eyes fixed on our son's glowing future. Not a single thank you left his lips, not even a glance of acknowledgement. I had bought the night, but he had erased me from it entirely. Driving home, the silence in the car felt heavier than stone. I gripped the wheel, asking myself why I still believed he would come back to me. That night, a new truth whispered inside me. Love without respect is only humiliation dressed in hope. By the time Christmas arrived, I had convinced myself things might change. I bought a new blazer, polished my shoes, even wrapped a gift for Brandon, an antique fountain pen I had carried since my first days at the bank. I thought perhaps he would see it as a symbol, a reminder that his success was born from the sacrifices I once made. I walked into that hotel lobby with hope still flickering inside me, fragile but alive. The place was dressed in gold and green. A towering Christmas tree sparkled with ornaments, and carols drifted from the speakers. I spotted Brandon across the room, surrounded by colleagues and his wife's family. He looked confident, untouchable, like he belonged to their world completely. Still, I held my head high. I was proud that my son had reached this point, even if he no longer looked my way. When the time came for speeches, I stood ready, waiting to be called. My heart beat fast, not from fear, but from the thought of hearing him acknowledge me even briefly. Instead, he grabbed the microphone, his face twisted in something darker than indifference. His voice rang across the hall. "Security! Get him out! He's not my dad!" The words sliced through the music. Gasps echoed. The lights on the tree flickered as if even they recoiled. Dozens of eyes turned toward me, wine glass still in my hand. My wife stood silently at his side, her expression carved in stone. Not once did she move to defend me. Not once did she correct him. A guard approached, and the room blurred with whispers. I felt my chest burn, but no tears came. I set the glass on a passing tray, nodded once, and walked toward the exit. Behind me, laughter resumed, forced and uneasy, like nothing had happened. Outside, the night air cut into me. My hands trembled, not from weakness, but from the weight of realization. Love had been buried, respect had been denied, and family had chosen their side. I walked away in silence, but inside, a decision had been born. I would return not with pleading words, but with the truth, and with the law on my side. That night, sleep refused to come. I lay on my bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every detail of the humiliation. The hotel lobby, the glittering tree, Brandon's voice echoing like a curse. He's not my dad. I could almost hear the carols cutting off, the crowd shifting in their seats. The silence that pressed on me like a heavy stone. I shut my eyes, but the memory only grew louder. I kept thinking, how did we get here? How does a son erase the man who raised him with a single sentence? The question circled in my mind, like a bird that refused to land. I pressed my palms against my face, fighting the weight of tears I refused to shed. Dignity was all I had left, and even that felt fragile. But beneath the pain, memories stirred. Not the bitter ones, not yet. The sweet ones. Nights when Brandon was small and restless, crying in his crib until I carried him against my chest. His little hands would clutch my shirt as his breathing slowed. In those quiet hours, I promised him he would never feel alone in this world. I swore to be the father I never had. I remembered running beside him on his first bike ride, catching him just before he toppled over. His laugh, pure, unbroken, was worth every scraped knee of mine. I remembered his soccer games. When I left the office early, tie loosened, still in my suit, cheering like a madman from the bleachers. He used to wave at me after every goal, proud that his dad was watching. And I remembered the nights he struggled with homework, head in his hands. I sat beside him, patient, explaining numbers until the frustration turned to relief. "Thanks, Dad," he'd mumble before drifting to sleep at the table. Those moments were fuel for me. They were the reason I worked long hours, the reason I stayed up late counting coins and balancing accounts. Everything I did was for him. Lying there, sleepless, I held onto those memories like lifelines. Because if I didn't, I might have drowned in the truth. The boy I once carried had grown into a man who wanted me erased. The longer I stared into the dark, the more the past pressed against me. Memories unfolded like old photographs, each one stained with sacrifice. I had given Brandon everything I had, yet it felt like nothing counted now. When he was accepted into the private academy, the tuition was more than I could handle. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, bills spread before me, my wife asking if it was worth the strain. "Yes," I told her. "He deserves the best." So I worked longer hours at the bank, taking shifts others refused. I came home past midnight, exhausted, but with enough money to keep his place secure among the children of lawyers and doctors. Then came the promotion offer. A senior position overseas, more money, more recognition. I turned it down. Brandon was only 12 then, and I didn't want to uproot him or become a father who phoned in from another continent. I chose him over ambition, telling myself careers can wait, but a child's childhood never returns. Weekends were no different. While colleagues golfed, I drove Brandon to soccer practices, science fairs, piano recitals. I sat in the bleachers, briefcase beside me, reviewing paperwork between games. Some fathers thought of themselves first. I never did. Brandon's victories were mine, his struggles my responsibility. I believed that's what being a father meant, being the shield and the ladder at the same time. But as the years passed, I began to notice how much I had traded away. My health wore thin from sleepless nights. My peers advanced in the bank while I stayed behind. We never traveled as a family because there was never enough left after tuition, books, and uniforms. I swallowed the sacrifices, convinced it was all for love. Now, lying awake after the Christmas betrayal, I wondered if any of it had mattered. Did he ever see the cost? Did he ever care that his future was paid with my time, my youth, my ambitions buried quietly in the dark? The silence that answered was louder than his words. One of the heaviest sacrifices came when Brandon was 20. He walked into the living room, eyes blazing with excitement, clutching sketches and notes. "Dad, I've got an idea for a company," he said. His words spilled faster than his breath apps. Investors, offices, the future. But when he got to the part about money, his voice cracked. He had none, and the bank would never trust an untested dreamer. I looked out the window that night at the harbor where my modest yacht was moored. She wasn't much, but she was mine, a dream I had saved for through decades of work. I pictured quiet retirements, fishing trips, sunsets with my wife. For years that boat had been my light at the end of the tunnel. And then I thought of Brandon, desperate, eyes full of hope. In that moment the dream shifted. I chose him over me. I sold her, signed the papers, handed over the keys, and took the check to my son. His face lit up, arms wrapped tight around me. "I won't let you down, Dad," he promised. Those words branded themselves onto me like fire. I believed him with all my heart. The money went to rent an office, buy computers, pay the small team of friends he had gathered. I watched him move into his first apartment, furnished with my savings, polished with my sweat. He strutted like he owned the city, while I stood quietly in the background, proud of the man he was becoming. I thought my sacrifice was an investment in both our futures. But the years blurred, and gratitude faded into entitlement. The promises vanished, replaced by arrogance. When people asked him how he started, he said, "Hard work and vision." My name disappeared from his story, erased as neatly as chalk wiped from a board. Lying awake after the Christmas humiliation, I remembered that night at the harbor and the hollow ache of watching the yacht sail away without me. I traded freedom for his future, and now that future stood on a stage and declared I was nothing to him. As Brandon's business grew, so did the distance between us. Success changes people, but I never expected it to turn my own wife against me. She used to defend me, remind Brandon to respect his father. But once the money started flowing from his marriage and his company, her loyalty shifted quietly, like a chair being pulled from under me. It began with whispers at home. "Pablo, don't be so controlling. Let Brandon breathe." Or, "You don't understand his world anymore." I brushed it off at first, convincing myself she was only trying to keep the peace. But soon her words sharpened. "You're holding him back. He doesn't need you interfering." And finally, the one that cut deepest. "You should be proud from a distance." A distance. That was the new role assigned to me, an observer, not a father. I noticed how they excluded me from conversations about his company, about his future. Decisions were made at dinners I was not invited to, in houses where I sat as a guest rather than family. My advice, once trusted, was dismissed as outdated. My stories, once cherished, were silenced with sighs and rolled eyes. One evening, I walked into the living room to find my wife and son laughing together over a deal he had closed. I tried to join in, but Brandon's tone cut me down. "Dad, you wouldn't understand. This is real business, not your old-fashioned banking." My wife chuckled softly, agreeing. I sat there, invisible, shrinking in my own home. The loneliness was worse than the insults. It was like watching my family slowly erase me, stroke by stroke, until I was only a shadow in the frame. I told myself love would bring them back. That sacrifice would remind them of my worth. But every day, the silence grew louder, the gap wider. When I think back to those moments now, I see the truth clearly. Betrayal doesn't come all at once. It seeps in, slow and patient, until one day you wake up and realize the people you bled for have been sharpening their knives for years. I thought the engagement party would heal the cracks. Foolish, maybe, but I still believed generosity could remind Brandon of where he came from. I signed every check, venue, catering, flowers, even the band. I poured what was left of my savings into that night. I told myself, this is family. This will bring us closer again. But when the lights dimmed and the celebration began, I realized I had only purchased my own humiliation. Brandon moved through the crowd with his fiancée, hand in hand, introducing her family with pride. Every compliment, every cheer was directed their way. I stood at the edge, waiting for my turn, waiting for him to look at me the way he once did. That look never came. When the master of ceremonies asked for words from the family, Brandon gestured to his future father-in-law. The man spoke warmly, receiving applause as though he had raised my son himself. I braced, waiting for Brandon to hand me the microphone next. But he didn't. The music returned, laughter filled the room, and my name was never spoken. Later, I overheard him speaking to one of her cousins. "This is Pablo," he said, waving a dismissive hand toward me. "He helps out sometimes. Helps out, as if decades of sacrifice were reduced to an occasional favor." My throat tightened, but I forced a smile, unwilling to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. At the end of the night, I walked out into the cool air, my wife trailing behind, silent as always. Brandon never said thank you, never acknowledged what I had done. I had paid for his night of glory, but I was erased from the story. Now, after the Christmas betrayal, that memory gnawed at me. It was not the first time he cut me out, it was simply the loudest, and in that silence after the music, I finally understood I had mistaken sacrifice for love returned. In truth, I had only been feeding a fire that would one day consume me. Loneliness is not the absence of people, it is the absence of recognition. Even when I sat at the same table as my family, I felt like an empty chair. Brandon spoke endlessly about his company, his travels, his future. My wife listened, eyes shining with admiration. When I tried to join, my words slid off the conversation, like rain on glass. They did not land. They did not matter. Holidays, once filled with laughter, grew colder. Thanksgiving passed with a polite invitation, but my seat was pushed to the far corner, next to people who barely knew me. I watched Brandon carve the turkey while her father gave the toast. No one asked me to speak. No one even glanced my way. I raised my glass in silence, drinking to memories no one else seemed to remember. Birthdays were worse. I gave him a watch I had saved for something classic, timeless. He accepted it with a quick nod, then turned to show off the luxury gift his in-laws had bought. My wife leaned in to admire theirs, barely looking at mine. It felt like handing over my heart only to see it dropped in a drawer. The house grew quieter, too. Brandon called less, visited rarely, and when he did, his conversations were short, rushed. "Busy, Dad. I don't have time." The words stung, because I had always made time. I had given him my hours, my nights, my youth. And now, I was allotted minute scraps of his attention. I told myself it was a phase, that children grow distant, then return. But deep down, I knew better. I could feel the door closing, slowly but surely, until all that remained was a crack of light. And then, at that Christmas gala, he slammed it shut for good. Remembering all this, I realized the betrayal hadn't begun with his words into the microphone. It had begun years earlier, in the quiet moments, when he chose to look through me instead of at me. The humiliation was public, but the erasure had been private, patient, and complete. In the nights that followed the Christmas gala, sleep became a stranger. I walked through the house in silence, every room echoing with ghosts of the past. The dining table where Brandon once showed me his school projects now felt like a museum exhibit, evidence of a life that no longer existed. The walls themselves seemed to whisper, "He's not my dad." I replayed the moment again and again. His face twisted with disgust, finger pointed like a weapon, voice cutting through music and laughter. The way my wife stood beside him, unmoving, silent. Not one person rose to defend me. Hundreds of eyes on me. Yet I had never felt more invisible. That humiliation replayed on a loop until it carved itself into me. But in between the shame, I remembered. I remembered the sacrifices, the nights I stayed late at the bank so he could afford tuition. I remembered selling the yacht, handing over my retirement dream so he could build his company. I remembered the engagement party, when I paid every bill only to be erased from the spotlight. Each memory struck like a hammer, forging something harder inside me. I realized then that betrayal is not an accident. It is a choice repeated until it becomes a habit. Brandon had chosen again and again to erase me. My wife had chosen silence over loyalty, and I had chosen to swallow it until that night. By the time dawn came, the decision was clear. No more quiet suffering. No more buying affection with sacrifice. The boy I had raised was gone, replaced by a man who saw me as an obstacle. And if that was the case, then I would no longer play the role of the silent, discarded father. I sat at my desk, opened the drawer I had avoided for years, and laid out the papers. Contracts, receipts, documents with signatures that carried weight. Proof that everything he flaunted had been built on my foundation. My humiliation had given birth to clarity. If Brandon wanted to erase me, he would have to erase the truth first, and that truth was written in ink he could not wash away. The drawer creaked as I pulled it open, dust rising like old secrets. Inside lay folders I hadn't touched in years, contracts, receipts, and copies of agreements I had once guarded like treasure. I ran my fingers across the papers, their edges sharp, their weight heavy with memory. Every page was proof that my sacrifices had not been whispers but inked commitments. The first file I opened took me back to the early days of Brandon's company. The ownership agreement stared up at me, my name printed clearly as the majority shareholder. I remembered signing it in his cramped apartment, the smell of takeout boxes and fresh ambition in the air. "Just until I get on my feet, Dad," he had said. "Once the investors come, we'll update it." I believed him. I never asked for changes, never demanded recognition. I thought my trust was enough. But now, seeing my signature above his, I felt something shift inside me. He might have erased me from his stories, but the law had not forgotten. The company was not his alone. By every legal measure, I was still the backbone of what he claimed as his empire. I sifted through more files: bank transfers for tuition, receipts for his first apartment, contracts for the engagement party venue. Every document whispered the same truth: I had been more than a father. I had been the financier, the safety net, the silent architect of his world. And all along he had built walls to keep me out. I leaned back in my chair, the papers spread before me like a map of betrayal. For the first time in years, I did not feel powerless. The humiliation of that Christmas night still burned, but now it was fuel. Brandon thought his words could erase me, but these documents told a different story, one written in black and white, undeniable and binding. I closed the drawer slowly, a grim calm settling over me. I had found my weapon, and unlike love, unlike loyalty, this one could not be ignored. The more I examined the documents, the clearer the truth became. Buried among the stacks was the original shareholder agreement, stamped and notarized, with my name holding the majority of the company's shares. Brandon had never filed the amendments he once promised. He was too busy basking in the glow of success, too confident that I would never question him. His arrogance had left the foundation untouched, and I was still the one standing on it. I held the paper in my hands, reading my own name over and over, as though I needed to be sure it was real. For years, he had treated me as if I were a burden, an old man clinging to the past. But on paper, I was the majority owner of the empire he flaunted at every dinner, every gala. The irony almost made me laugh. I thought of that Christmas night, his voice booming through the microphone. "He's not my dad," but the ink told another story. Not only was I his father without me, he had no company, no wealth, no place among the people he tried so hard to impress. I flipped through more pages, seeing the pattern. Every time he needed help, I had stepped in, co-signing loans, wiring funds, paying deposits. And every time, he had sworn it was temporary. "Just until I get settled, Dad. Just until the next investor comes." But the next investor had been me, again and again, disguised as sacrifice. I realized then that Brandon had built his fortune on two things: my money and my silence. He had counted on both to last forever. But the silence was over. The man he had disowned still held the keys, and the papers in my hands were iron bars locking him into a truth he could not escape. I placed the agreement neatly back into the folder, my heart steady for the first time in weeks. He thought he had buried me. He forgot that paper does not rot, and ink does not forget. Back home, I spread the papers across my desk like pieces of a puzzle. But it wasn't just ownership agreements and contracts I needed. It was the story behind them, the trail of sacrifices Brandon had buried beneath his arrogance. If I was going to confront him, it would not be with anger alone. It would be with proof. I dug into old boxes stored in the attic, folders yellowed with time, envelopes marked with dates in my careful handwriting. One by one, I opened them: tuition receipts from the academy, bank slips from transfers I had made during his university years, invoices for furniture, laptops, and appliances I bought for his first apartment. Even the catering bill for the engagement party, my signature at the bottom, payment in full. Each page told the same story. I had been there at every turn, funding every milestone, standing behind him while he pretended to stand alone. I stacked them in neat piles, labeling each with a sticky note: education, housing, company, engagement, proof not just of money but of devotion. The deeper I went, the more I uncovered. Letters from his younger years, notes of gratitude in a boy's handwriting. "Thanks for the new shoes, Dad. You're the best." I paused, staring at the childish scrawl, feeling the sting of tears I refused to let fall. Somewhere along the way, that boy had vanished, replaced by a man who looked at me with contempt. By the time I finished, my desk was covered in evidence. It was more than paper, it was a timeline of sacrifice, a ledger of love paid in full, and now it would serve as my arsenal. Brandon thought I was powerless, but every receipt, every invoice, every signature was a reminder of the truth he wanted buried. I sat back in my chair, surrounded by decades of devotion turned ammunition. For the first time, I realized I was not preparing to fight for my dignity. I was preparing to reclaim it. Amid the mountain of receipts and contracts, I discovered something far more fragile: old home videos, stored on dusty DVDs. I had nearly forgotten them. My hands trembled as I slid one into the player, the screen flickering to life with grainy images of a time when love still felt unshakable. There was Brandon, at 8 years old, holding up a trophy nearly bigger than himself. He looked straight into the camera, sweat on his forehead, and shouted, "This one's for you, Dad." The crowd behind him clapped, but all I heard was the sincerity in his little voice. My chest tightened as the screen shifted to another clip. Christmas morning. He was 10, hair messy from sleep, tearing into wrapping paper. When he pulled out the toy car set I had saved months to buy, his eyes lit up like fireworks. He ran to me, wrapping his arms around my neck. "You're the best dad ever." I paused the video there, staring at the frozen image of a boy who had once believed those words. I played more school plays where he scanned the crowd until he found me, soccer games where he waved after every goal. And then a quieter moment. Brandon at 13, sitting at his desk, exhausted from studying. He glanced at the camera I had left recording and muttered, "Thanks, Dad, for everything." He didn't know I was listening. That truth had slipped from him, unguarded, pure. Tears blurred my vision, but I let them fall. These were not just memories. They were proof, undeniable evidence that I had been the center of his world once. The boy who had loved me had been real, and the man who now despised me had grown out of that same soil. I burned those images into my mind, knowing they might be useful. Not as weapons of shame, but as reminders both to him and to the world that our story had not always been one of rejection. If he tried to erase me, I would show them the boy who once shouted proudly, "This one's for you, Dad." With the documents stacked, the videos saved, and the contracts neatly filed, I met with my lawyer once more. His office smelled of leather and ink, a place where words turned into weapons. I laid the evidence before him like a general placing maps on a war table. He studied each page, each receipt, each clip, nodding slowly as the picture formed. When the Christmas video played, he leaned back, exhaling sharply. "This is devastating," he said. "No one can argue with this. If we present it to the board, Brandon's credibility will shatter." I folded my hands on the desk, my voice calm. "Good. But I don't want a spectacle for the sake of vengeance. I want precision. I want him stripped, not by anger, but by the very truth he thought he could bury." He tapped his pen against the table. "Then, here's the plan. We call a board meeting. You reveal your shareholder position. We show them the paper trail, every payment, every sacrifice. And then we end with this video. The contrast will be undeniable. They will see the father who built him and the son who denied him." I closed my eyes for a moment, imagining it the silence in the boardroom, the shame spreading across his face. Not because I screamed, not because I begged, but because his own actions condemned him. The lawyer continued, "Afterward, we transfer your shares into a private trust. That way, he can never touch them again. He will be forced to live with the reality that you hold the keys, while he holds nothing." I nodded, feeling a calm resolve settle deep within me. This was no longer about humiliation. It was about justice. Every sacrifice I had made would be acknowledged. Every betrayal exposed. He wanted me gone, erased. Instead, I would leave him standing in the ruins of his own choices. Walking out of the office that day, I felt lighter. The plan was set. The weapon was ready. And soon, the world would know the truth that ink, paper, and video had preserved. The boardroom smelled of polished wood and cold ambition. Men and women in tailored suits shuffled papers, their eyes fixed on Brandon at the head of the table. He looked confident, speaking with that same arrogance he wore at the Christmas gala, unaware that his stage was about to collapse beneath him. I entered quietly with my lawyer, carrying the same folder I had opened weeks before. Brandon's smile faltered for only a second before he covered it with disdain. "What's he doing here?" he snapped, glancing around for support. The directors shifted uncomfortably unsure. My lawyer cleared his throat. "Mr. Castillo has the right to be here. As majority shareholder, his presence is not optional, it is required." A murmur spread across the room. Brandon froze, his confidence cracking. "That's ridiculous. I run this company. I placed the documents on the table and slid them forward. The stamped agreements, the signed contracts, evidence undeniable. You may run it day to day, I said evenly, my voice carrying the weight of years he had tried to erase. But you run it for me. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of papers turning as the board members read the truth for themselves. Brandon's face reddened, his mouth opening and closing without words. For once, he was speechless. I leaned back in my chair, calm and steady. I did not need to shout. The ink spoke louder than any anger could. My humiliation at Christmas had been public, but this was private justice, the beginning of his unraveling. The chairman cleared his throat. It appears Mr. Pablo Castillo is, in fact, the majority shareholder. We will need to reconsider several matters moving forward. Brandon slammed his fist against the table, but the sound was hollow. For the first time, he realized the empire he claimed was built on a foundation that never belonged to him, and I was no longer the silent father in the shadows. I was the man holding the keys. The next meeting was not about numbers or forecasts. It was about truth. The directors sat in silence as I opened a laptop and placed it at the center of the table. Brandon shifted uncomfortably, sensing what was coming. He tried to speak, but my lawyer raised a hand. Please, let's allow Mr. Castillo to present. With a click, the video began. The Christmas gala filled the screen, laughter, music, the glittering tree. Then Brandon's voice cut through it all. Security, get him out! He's not my dad! Gasps erupted from the board members just as they had that night. The footage froze on my face, humiliated yet composed, before fading to black. No one spoke. The silence was louder than any accusation. I looked around the table, meeting each director's eyes. That, I said calmly, is how the man you trust with this company treats the one who built it. That is the measure of his character. Brandon shot up from his chair, his voice frantic. This is manipulation. He's twisting everything. But the panic in his tone betrayed him. The directors did not look at me. They looked at him, and their expressions were heavy with doubt. I slid another folder forward, receipts, contracts, the proof of every sacrifice I had made to fund his rise. I gave him everything, education, housing, capital. And this is how he repaid it, by erasing me in front of hundreds. If he will deny his own father, what loyalty can you expect from him as your leader? The chairman adjusted his glasses, his voice measured. Mr. Brandon Castillo, these are serious concerns. Your conduct reflects not only on yourself but on this entire board. I leaned back, letting the evidence speak. My heart was steady. I did not need vengeance. I only needed the truth laid bare. And as Brandon sank back into his seat, his confidence draining from him, I knew the unraveling had begun. The days after the board meeting moved like falling dominoes. Once the truth was out, Brandon's allies began to scatter. People who had once praised him suddenly grew quiet, stepping back from his side. Investors who used to greet him with firm handshakes now avoided his calls. Silence followed him like a shadow he could not shake. I watched it happen with a calm detachment. There was no satisfaction in seeing him crumble, only inevitability. The world he had built on arrogance was collapsing under the weight of facts. Reputation, once his strongest weapon, was now his greatest weakness. One evening, I overheard two directors in the hallway after a meeting. If he can deny his own father in public, imagine what he'll do to us. The words struck me with a cold finality. Brandon had not just betrayed me, he had betrayed trust itself. And trust, once broken, is never repaired. Even his wife's family, the ones he had clung to as his ladder upward, began to withdraw. Invitations to dinner stopped. Business introductions dried up. I heard whispers that her father was reconsidering their financial ties, unwilling to be associated with a man whose character had been exposed so brutally. At home, my wife grew restless. She still stood by him in words, but even she could not deny the tide turning. She asked me once, almost pleading, "Do you have to push this so far?" I looked at her, tired but steady. "I didn't push, Maria. He did. I'm only holding up the mirror." She said nothing after that. Brandon, once the golden son, now walked into meetings with a forced smile, the desperation in his eyes impossible to hide. The empire he thought was unshakable was slipping, piece by piece, through the cracks of his own arrogance. And I didn't need to lift a finger. The truth was doing all the work. Once the board saw the truth and his allies began to scatter, I moved to secure what was mine. It wasn't enough to expose Brandon's betrayal. I needed to make sure he could never undo it. Quietly, with my lawyer's guidance, I transferred all of my shares into a private trust. My name remained on the papers, but the control shifted beyond his reach. No tantrum, no manipulation, no plea could take it away from me now. The process was meticulous. Signatures, seals, witnesses. Each stroke of the pen felt like another wall rising between Brandon and the empire he thought he owned. I imagined him trying to claw his way back, only to find doors locked, windows sealed. The company he paraded as his crown jewel was legally mine, shielded forever from his recklessness. But I didn't stop there. I prepared one final stroke. From the same secure folder, I pulled the video of the Christmas gala the moment he denied me, captured in crystal clarity. With a steady hand, I sent it to every member of the board, attached with a brief note. "This is the man you entrust with leadership." The responses came quickly, some short, some stunned. A few simply said, "Unacceptable." Others, "We need to discuss this immediately." The tide was no longer turning, it had fully shifted. Brandon's foundation was collapsing beneath him, and he had handed me the hammer. The night I finalized the transfer, I sat alone at my desk, the house quiet. For years, I had felt powerless, stripped of respect, erased from my own family. Now, I was no longer fighting for recognition. I was guarding what I had built. The humiliation he had poured over me had been turned into iron resolve. Brandon believed I was finished the night he called security. He thought I was walking away defeated. But in truth, I was only beginning. And with every document signed, every file sent, I was writing the final chapter of his empire. The documents and the trust secured my control, but truth deserved a wider audience. Brandon had humiliated me in public, so the reckoning would not remain confined to a boardroom. Carefully, discreetly, I reached out to a handful of journalists and community leaders, people who valued integrity over spectacle. I did not rant or embellish. I simply handed them the evidence. The story wrote itself. A father who had sacrificed everything to build his son's future. A son who, blinded by pride, denied him in front of hundreds. Contracts, receipts, videos, all irrefutable. Within days, whispers began spreading through business circles. Then headlines appeared. The empire built on betrayal. Major shareholder exposes CEO's public humiliation of father. I watched the news unfold from my living room, the television casting a cold glow. Brandon's photo flashed across the screen. No longer a golden boy, but a cautionary tale. His name trended for all the wrong reasons. Investors panicked. Clients questioned their contracts. His wife's family, once his shield, remained silent. Silence that spoke louder than defense. For years, I had endured humiliation in private. Now the world saw what I had endured. Not through my bitterness, but through Brandon's own words, captured and undeniable. Every time the clip played on the news, I felt the sting lessen, replaced by something steadier, vindication. Neighbors who once pitied me stopped me on the street, shaking my hand. "You deserved better, Pablo." Colleagues from the bank called, their voices filled with respect I hadn't heard in years. I did not boast, did not gloat. I simply listened, nodded, and let the truth speak for itself. Brandon's empire wasn't collapsing because I struck it down. It was collapsing because it had been hollow all along, built on arrogance and denial. I had only opened the doors and let the world see inside. The backlash was swift. What had begun as whispers in boardrooms and newspaper columns soon spread to the streets, the cafes, the very community that once praised Brandon as a visionary. People who had cheered his speeches now shook their heads in disappointment. He was no longer a symbol of ambition, he was a symbol of betrayal. I walked through town one morning, and an old friend stopped me. "I saw the news," he said, gripping my hand. "You gave him everything, and that's how he treated you? Shameful." Others echoed the sentiment. Some spoke with anger, others with quiet sympathy, but the message was the same. The truth had landed where it needed to. At his company, the change was even sharper. Employees avoided his gaze. Meetings ended in awkward silences. Investors pulled funding, citing concerns about leadership integrity. I knew the language well. It was the polite mask of fear and distrust. Brandon had burned the bridge of respect, and no amount of apologies could rebuild it. His wife's family, once his proudest allies, now kept their distance. They stopped attending public events with him, their polished smiles replaced with calculated absence. In high society, absence is louder than any accusation. Brandon's empire was shrinking not from attack, but from abandonment. Meanwhile, I remained silent. I did not argue, did not explain. I simply let the documents, the video, and the whispers of truth do their work. For years, I had been the man erased from the story. Now, without lifting a hand in malice, I had become the part of the story no one could ignore. And as I watched his world shrink day by day, I felt no joy, no triumph, only certainty. This was the cost of arrogance. This was the weight of betrayal finally coming due. It was only a matter of time before Brandon came to me directly. One evening, just after sunset, I heard a knock at my door. When I opened it, there he was, my son. The same man who had cast me out in front of hundreds, now standing on my porch with desperation etched across his face. "Dad," he started, voice trembling, "we need to talk." I stepped aside, letting him in without a word. He looked smaller than I remembered, stripped of the confidence he wore like armor. He sat at my table, the same table where I once helped him with homework, where I once told him stories of perseverance. Now, silence stretched between us. Finally, he spoke. "I made a mistake. I went too far that night. The company's under pressure. Investors are pulling out. The media won't stop. Please, help me fix this." His words hung in the air, but they did not move me. I had replayed his voice in my head too many times. He's not my dad. I had carried that wound like a stone, and now he wanted me to drop it as if it were nothing. "I gave you everything," I said quietly. "My time, my money, my sacrifices. And when the moment came, you denied me." He lowered his head. "I was angry. I was trying to impress them. I didn't mean—" I cut him off with a raised hand. "You didn't mean for the world to hear the truth of how you see me. But they did. And now you want me to erase it for you." He looked up, eyes wet. "Please, you're my father." I felt the sting of those words, but I stayed firm. "No, Brandon. You said otherwise. And now, I believe you." The silence that followed was colder than any winter. He left soon after, shoulders slumped, the weight of his choices finally pressing down. I did not follow him. I had nothing left to give. The final blow came at the next board meeting. The room was tense, filled with directors who had seen the evidence, the video, the headlines. Brandon walked in looking worn, his once perfect suit hanging loose on his frame. He tried to smile, but the weight of his disgrace bent his shoulders. The chairman called the meeting to order. "We are here to vote on leadership moving forward. Concerns about Mr. Brandon Castillo's conduct and credibility have been raised. Majority shareholder Mr. Pablo Castillo has requested this session." Brandon shot me a look, half pleading, half defiant. I did not return it. I placed the folder in front of me, though I did not need to open it. Everyone in that room already knew the truth. The vote was swift. One by one, the directors cast their decision. Words like integrity, trust, and responsibility filled the air. When the count was read, Brandon was officially stripped of his authority. His voice, once booming with arrogance, was now silenced by the very people who had once applauded him. He stood, fists trembling at his sides. "You can't do this to me. I built this company." I rose slowly, my eyes locked on his. My voice was steady, cold, final. "No, Brandon. You built it on my sacrifices, and then you tried to erase me. This isn't revenge. This is justice." The room fell silent. Brandon's face twisted, searching for words, but none came. He turned and stormed out, the sound of the door closing behind him echoing like the end of an era. I remained seated, breathing deeply, calm washing over me. For the first time in years, I felt no weight pressing on my chest. I had not shouted, had not begged. I had only revealed the truth, and the truth had done what I could not. As the meeting adjourned, one director placed a hand on my shoulder. "You did the right thing," he said quietly. I nodded, though I already knew. Justice, at last, had found its place. In the quiet that followed, I finally felt the weight lift. For years, humiliation had been my shadow, following me through every room, every memory. But now, there was peace. Brandon no longer held power over me, not as a son who disowned me, not as a man who mocked me, not as the leader of a company I had built with my own sacrifices. The truth had stripped him bare, and in that truth, I found my freedom. I spent mornings walking through the park, watching children play with the kind of joy Brandon once had. Their laughter didn't sting me anymore. It reminded me of the boy he used to be, the boy who waved at me from the soccer field, the boy who once whispered, "Thanks, Dad." That boy was gone, but the memories remained, and I could hold them without breaking. Neighbors greeted me differently now. They didn't look at me with pity, but with respect. "You stood tall," one told me as I passed the market. "You showed us all what dignity looks like." I nodded, humbled. I hadn't sought admiration, only justice. Yet dignity has a way of returning once you stop begging for it. At home, I found comfort in silence. No phone buzzing with demands, no expectations pulling me thin. I cooked simple meals, read old books, even dusted off the fountain pen I had once meant to give Brandon. It sat on my desk now, not as a gift, but as a reminder. Some things must remain with the ones who value them. For the first time in decades, I breathed without heaviness in my chest. I was no longer a father desperate for recognition. I was a man who had faced betrayal and survived it, not with bitterness, but with truth. And truth, I realized, was the only inheritance worth leaving behind. It didn't take long for Brandon's world to unravel completely. News spread of his removal, of the scandal that had defined him. Investors cut ties. His once loyal friends vanished. Even the family he had married into, the ones he had chosen over me, withdrew their support. I heard whispers that his wife moved back into her parents' home, leaving him in an empty apartment that was once filled with laughter and ambition. I didn't celebrate his downfall. I didn't need to. It was not my victory, it was simply the truth playing itself out. When you build a life on arrogance and denial, it eventually caves in. He was living proof. One evening, I walked past the very hotel where the Christmas gala had taken place. The lights glowed the same way. Carols floated through the air, but the memory no longer stung. I stood there for a while, watching people enter in fine clothes, carrying their own hopes, their own illusions, and I realized I no longer carried the humiliation of that night. Brandon did, forever. Back at home, I received letters from old colleagues, men and women who remembered me not as the man abandoned by his family, but as the one who stood firm when it mattered. "You showed us that truth still has a place," one wrote. Their words warmed me more than any applause ever could. As for my wife, she tried once or twice to reach out. A phone call, a message. "Maybe we can talk," she said. But I did not answer. She had chosen her silence when I needed her voice most. Some choices cannot be undone. Brandon's life crumbled, mine steadied. I wasn't richer, not in money, but in peace. And peace, I learned, is the rarest wealth a man can hold. With Brandon stripped of power and me free of his shadow, I began to think about what came next. For decades, my energy had been spent on him, his dreams, his education, his comfort. Now, for the first time, I asked myself, what about me? I turned my attention to causes that had been close to my heart but long neglected. Education for children who couldn't afford it. Community projects to help families struggling the way mine once had. I redirected the dividends from the company into scholarships, building something lasting, something that didn't depend on Brandon's approval or recognition. If my sacrifices were to mean anything, it would be in giving opportunities to those who still knew how to value them. Neighbors noticed the change. They saw me volunteering, speaking quietly at local events, investing not in monuments but in futures. "You don't look bitter," one said. I smiled. Because I'm not. I left bitterness behind with him. At home, I found myself lighter, freer. My mornings were mine again. I walked without looking over my shoulder, without wondering if I'd be ignored or humiliated. I planted a small garden, something I'd always wanted but never had time for. Each sprout felt like a symbol of renewal growth born from patience and care. Sometimes I caught myself thinking of Brandon, of the boy he once was. The videos of him saying, "Thanks, Dad," still sat in my drawer, but I no longer clung to them. They were memories, not chains. The man he had become was not my responsibility anymore. I had given him my youth. Now, I gave myself my peace. And in that choice, I finally learned what true freedom felt like. It was my wife who tried hardest to mend what she had broken. After Brandon's fall, she came to me, her voice softer than it had been in years. "Pablo, maybe we can start over. Maybe we can forget what happened." Her words stung more than they soothed. Forget? How do you forget the silence of a spouse who stood by while your son erased you in public? How do you erase the image of her at his side while I was humiliated, treated like a stranger? No, forgetting was not an option. Some betrayals are carved too deep. I listened, but I did not embrace her. I heard her pleas, but I did not offer comfort. She had chosen her side when it mattered most, and in that moment, she chose wrong. Love without loyalty is only an empty word. We spoke a few times after that, always circling around the same hollow apologies. She wanted the past back, but the past was gone. I had buried it the night Brandon pointed at me and denied my existence. She asked if we could rebuild, but I told her calmly, "You cannot rebuild a house on rotten beams." Her eyes filled with tears, but I felt no anger, no hatred, only clarity. The bond had been broken long before she admitted it. She had stood by while I was erased. That silence was louder than any insult. Eventually, she stopped calling. The house felt quieter, but not lonelier. Loneliness had been my companion for years, while living under the same roof, with people who pretended I didn't matter. Now, the silence was different. It was clean. It was mine. I learned then that sometimes freedom does not come from gaining more, it comes from letting go of what was never truly yours. With my wife gone and Brandon out of my life, I discovered a new rhythm. Simplicity became my comfort. I no longer woke with the weight of expectations pressing down on me. Instead, I rose early, brewed my coffee, and stepped out into the quiet morning air. The world felt new again, unburdened by the constant need to prove myself to those who had never valued me. I found peace in small things. Gardening became a ritual. I knelt in the soil, planting seeds with steady hands, watching sprouts push through the earth. There was something healing in its growth that came not from sacrifice, but from care freely given. Each bloom reminded me that life moves forward, that beauty can rise from what was once buried. Books, too, filled my evenings, stories of resilience, of justice, of people who endured and found peace. I read slowly, savoring every page, no longer rushing as though time was slipping away. Time, I realized, was finally mine. I even traveled a little, something I had postponed for decades. Not far, just small trips to places I had always meant to see. A coastal town with quiet harbors, a mountain trail where the air was crisp and unspoiled. I stood on those paths alone, but not lonely. There is a difference, and I finally understood it. Sometimes, neighbors would ask how I managed to stay so composed after everything. I would smile faintly and answer, "Because I lost nothing I wasn't meant to lose." It wasn't bitterness, it was truth. Brandon had made his choice. My wife had made hers, and I had finally made mine, to live free of their shadows. What I had now was not wealth or status, but dignity. And dignity, once regained, is worth more than anything I had ever given away. Over time, the community began to see me not as the man betrayed, but as the man restored. People approached me with respect, not pity. At the market, shopkeepers greeted me warmly. At church, neighbors shook my hand firmly, their eyes carrying quiet admiration. They no longer whispered about my humiliation, they spoke about my resolve. Even former colleagues from the bank sought me out. Some invited me to speak to young professionals about integrity, about sacrifice. "You've lived what we only teach in theory," one of them said. I accepted, not out of pride, but out of a sense of duty. If my story could prevent another man from being erased, then perhaps the pain had a purpose. I noticed, too, how the younger generation listened closely when I spoke. They leaned forward, eyes sharp, as I told them that success built on betrayal is failure in disguise. That dignity is the only currency that never loses value. Their nods, their questions, their gratitude, it reminded me that even after loss, life can carry meaning. At home, I kept to my quiet routines, gardening, reading, simple walks through the park. Yet everywhere I went, I carried myself differently, no longer bent under shame, but upright, steady. Betrayal had scarred me, yes, but it had also carved away illusions. What remained was a man stripped down to truth, and truth needs no adornment. Sometimes I wondered if Brandon saw these changes from afar, if the news of my calm dignity reached him through whispers. Perhaps it did. Perhaps it didn't. It no longer mattered. The respect I had regained wasn't his to give, it was mine to claim. And I claimed it fully. The last time I saw Brandon was not in a boardroom or at a gala, but by chance. I was walking through the city square, the winter air sharp against my skin, when I spotted him across the street. He looked older, worn down, his shoulders curved inward, as though the weight of his choices had finally settled. Our eyes met for a brief moment. His lips parted, as if to speak, but no words came. I simply held his gaze, calm and steady, before turning away. I did not need to hear him. The silence between us said everything. I walked on, each step lighter than the last. There was no anger left, no bitterness, no longing, only freedom. Freedom from a son who had erased me. Freedom from a wife who had abandoned me in silence. Freedom from the years of humiliation I had carried like chains. The past no longer bound me. It had been burned away, leaving only clarity. At home, I sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the evening settle over the garden I had grown with my own hands. The flowers swayed gently in the breeze, unconcerned with betrayal, unconcerned with pride. They simply lived. And so did I. I thought back to everything, every sacrifice, every humiliation, every tear I refused to shed. And I realized something. I had not lost. I had endured. I had turned their betrayal into my justice. And in that, I had won something greater than wealth or power. I had won myself back. As night fell, I whispered the words I had spoken in the boardroom, the words that had freed me. This isn't revenge. This is justice. And with that, I closed the chapter for good. No forgiveness, no looking back, only forward into a life that was finally, undeniably mine.